I've been driving hearses for Riverside Funeral Home for 8 years, and I thought I'd seen everything grief could throw at a person. My name is Marcus, and I handle the transports picking up from the morgue, delivering to viewings, and making that final journey to the cemetery. It's honest work, quiet work, and most days I appreciate the solitude. The deceased don't make conversation, don't complain about my driving, and they always arrive exactly where they need to be. In 8 years, I'd never had a single issue with any of my passengers until the morning I transported Eleanor Whitmore to her final rest. The call came in at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning in March. Standard pickup from our preparation room, transport to St. Mary's for a 10 o'clock service, then on to Oakwood Cemetery for burial. Eleanor had been 83, passed peacefully in her sleep according to the paperwork. Her mahogany casket was modest but well-crafted, and Director Morrison had mentioned she'd been a retired librarian who lived alone. No complications, no special requests, just the kind of straightforward service that made up most of my workload. I'd loaded Eleanor's casket myself that morning, same as always, wheeled the gurney to the back of the hearse, secured the rollers, and made sure everything was properly locked in place. The weight distribution felt normal as I closed the rear door. She couldn't have weighed more than 110 pounds, and the casket itself was standard weight. I'd done this same routine hundreds of times before. But as I pulled out of the funeral home parking lot and merged onto Maple Street, something felt different. The hearse seemed to settle lower on its suspension, like I was carrying twice the usual load. I checked my mirrors, glanced at the instrument panel, but everything appeared normal. Still, the sensation persisted, that heavy, dragging feeling you get when you're hauling a trailer that's loaded beyond capacity. I told myself it was probably just my imagination, maybe the result of too much coffee and not enough sleep. The spring roads were still rough from winter, full of potholes that could make any vehicle feel sluggish. But when I stopped at the red light on 5th and Morrison, I happened to glance in my rearview mirror to check the back compartment, and that's when I saw them. 2 silhouettes, where there should have been one. The casket sat in its usual position, properly secured and level, but beside it, or perhaps overlapping with it, the reflection made it hard to tell, was another shape. Another form lying parallel to Eleanor's casket, occupying the same space but somehow separate. I blinked hard, adjusted the mirror, even turned around to look directly into the back compartment. When I looked with my own eyes, I saw only Eleanor's casket, exactly as I'd loaded it. But in the mirror, there were definitely 2 forms. The light turned green, and I drove on, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. The second silhouette remained visible in the reflection, consistent and unmistakable. It appeared to be roughly the same size as Eleanor's casket, positioned at the same height, but offset by perhaps 6 inches to the left. When I adjusted the mirror to get a better angle, both shapes seemed to shift slightly, as if maintaining their relative positions no matter how I tried to view them. By the time I reached St. Mary's, my hands were damp with sweat, despite the cool morning air. I parked in the designated area behind the church and sat for a moment, studying the mirror. Both silhouettes were still there, clear as anything. But when I opened the rear door to begin unloading, I found only Eleanor's casket, undisturbed and properly secured. The funeral service proceeded without incident. Eleanor's nephew and his family were present, along with perhaps a dozen other mourners. They seemed like decent people, quiet and respectful, sharing gentle memories of a woman who dedicated her life to books and reading. I waited in the hearse during the service, occasionally checking the rearview mirror. The second silhouette had faded somewhat, but remained faintly visible, like a double exposure on an old photograph. After the service, I loaded Eleanor's casket for the final journey to Oakwood Cemetery. The hearse still felt unnaturally heavy as we formed the processional, and the second silhouette in my mirror had grown more distinct. By the time we reached the cemetery gates, it was as clear and defined as Eleanor's own casket. Oakwood Cemetery sits on 40 acres of rolling hills outside town, established in 1892 and filled with the kind of elaborate Victorian monuments that speak to an era when people built memorials to last forever. Eleanor's plot was in the newer section, where the headstones are modest and the landscaping is kept simple. The graveside service was briefer Few words from the minister, some final prayers, and the slow lowering of the casket into the earth. I was standing beside the hearse, waiting for the ceremony to conclude, when Eleanor's nephew approached me. He was a man in his 50s, wearing a well-pressed suit and the kind of composed expression that comes from years of managing other people's expectations. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quiet but puzzled. "I wanted to thank you for bringing the extra arrangement." I looked at him blankly. "I'm sorry." "The roses," he said, gesturing toward the gravesite. "The white roses. We hadn't ordered them, but they're beautiful. Very thoughtful of the funeral home to include them." I turned to look at the grave. Beside the modest spray of mixed flowers that the family had selected, there sat a large arrangement of white roses, elegant and fresh, positioned as if it had always belonged there. The roses were pristine, their petals full and unblemished, arranged in a style that suggested professional florist work. "I didn't bring any extra flowers," I said, my voice sounding strange even to myself. The nephew frowned. "But they were in your hearse. I saw you unloading them after Eleanor's casket." I stared at him, then back at the roses. I had no memory of unloading any additional arrangements. I could account for every moment of the transfer, from hearse to gravesite, the mechanical precision of the rollers, the careful positioning above the grave, the slow descent into the earth. There had been no second trip, no additional flowers. "Perhaps someone from the cemetery staff placed them there," I suggested, though even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The nephew nodded politely, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. He shook my hand, thanked me for my service, and rejoined his family as they prepared to leave. I watched them go, noting how several family members paused to admire the white roses, commenting on their beauty and wondering aloud who might have sent them. I waited until the cemetery had emptied before approaching Eleanor's grave. The white roses were real. I could smell their fragrance, see the slight tremor of their petals in the afternoon breeze. They were arranged in a heart shape, the kind of display that would have cost at least $200 from any decent florist. But more disturbing than their presence was their perfection. Every rose was in full bloom, not a single petal brown or wilted, as if they'd been cut and arranged moments before. I drove back to the funeral home in silence, checking my rearview mirror every few minutes. The second silhouette was gone, but the hearse no longer felt heavy. Whatever presence had accompanied Eleanor on her final journey had apparently chosen to remain at Oakwood Cemetery. That evening, I called Director Morrison and asked about the flowers. He had no record of any additional arrangements for Eleanor Whitmore. When I described the white roses, he was quiet for a long moment before telling me that sometimes these things just happen, that grief can manifest in unexpected ways. He didn't sound surprised, which bothered me more than if he'd been skeptical. I've continued driving for Riverside Funeral Home, but I pay closer attention to my mirrors now. Most transports proceed normally, but occasionally, perhaps once every few months, I'll catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there. An extra silhouette in the back compartment, a reflection that doesn't match reality, a sense of carrying more than I loaded. I've learned not to mention these experiences to the families. They have enough to process without worrying about the metaphysical logistics of their final farewells. But I've also learned to trust what I see in those mirrors, even when my direct vision tells me otherwise. Some passengers, it seems, don't travel alone. And sometimes, they leave flowers. There are places on every road that pull at you, though you never understand why until it's too late to turn back. My name is Rita, and I've been coordinating funeral transports for Meadowbrook Services for 15 years. In that time, I've driven every road, highway, and back route within a 100-mile radius of our facility. I know which streets flood in heavy rain, which intersections have blind spots that make families nervous, and which routes offer the smoothest ride for our most fragile passengers. But of all the roads I travel, State Route 27 to Hillcrest Cemetery has always felt different. It's a straight stretch of two-lane blacktop that cuts through farmland and pine forest, the kind of road that should be forgettable. Posted speed limit is 55. No major hills or curves. Well-maintained pavement that rarely gives our hearses any trouble. Most of my colleagues prefer it for Hillcrest transports because it's direct and peaceful, exactly the kind of dignified journey families expect for their loved one's final ride. But every time I drive that route, something happens at mile marker 14. I first noticed it 3 years ago during a transport for the Hendricks family. I was maintaining a steady 45 miles per hour, appropriate for a funeral procession, when I passed the small green sign marking mile 14. Without any conscious decision, my foot eased off the accelerator. The hearse slowed to perhaps 30 miles per hour, then 25, as if the vehicle itself had decided to pause. I remember glancing at the speedometer, puzzled by my own behavior, then gradually accelerating back to normal speed. At the time, I attributed it to fatigue or distraction. Funeral work demands constant attention to detail, and perhaps I'd simply lost focus for a moment. But over the following months, the same thing happened on every Hillcrest transport. Mile marker 14 would come into view, and I'd find myself slowing down, sometimes to barely 15 miles per hour, before continuing on. The deceleration felt natural, almost respectful, like the automotive equivalent of removing your hat in church. I began to think of it as a quirk of the route, maybe something about the sightlines or road conditions that subconsciously triggered caution. Other drivers occasionally asked about my slow pace through that section, but I had no good explanation to offer. The pattern continued without incident until last Thursday evening, when I transported Margaret Chen to Hillcrest for her Friday morning service. Margaret had been 78, a retired teacher who'd spent 40 years in the local school system. Her family described her as devoted, patient, and quietly religious, the kind of woman who'd baked cookies for every school fundraiser and remembered the birthdays of students from decades past. The transport should have been routine, a peaceful journey for someone who'd lived a full and meaningful life. I loaded Margaret's casket with particular care that evening. The latch mechanism was a standard brass fixture, the kind I'd secured thousands of times before. I tested it twice, ensuring the closure was firm and properly aligned. The casket sat level and stable in the hearse's cargo compartment, cushioned by the regulation padding, and secured with professional restraints. The drive to Hillcrest began normally. Thursday evening traffic was light, and I made good time through town and onto State Route 27. The autumn air was crisp, leaves just beginning to turn, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the farmland. It was the kind of peaceful evening that made funeral work feel like a calling rather than just a job. As always, I began to slow as mile marker 14 came into view, but this time, the deceleration felt different, more pronounced, almost urgent. My speed dropped to 20 miles per hour, then 15, then 10. The hearse seemed to resist my attempts to accelerate, as if something invisible was holding us back. I pressed the gas pedal more firmly, but the vehicle responded sluggishly. For perhaps 30 seconds, we crawled along that stretch of road at barely walking speed, the engine running normally, but the hearse behaving as if it were towing a massive weight. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the resistance lifted, and we resumed normal speed. It wasn't until I reached Hillcrest and began preparing for the morning service that I discovered the problem. As I performed my standard pre-delivery inspection, I found that Margaret's casket latch had come undone. Not broken or damaged, simply unlatched, as if someone had carefully released the mechanism during transport. In 15 years of funeral work, I had never seen a casket latch fail during transport. These mechanisms are designed to withstand significant stress and movement. They're tested, regulated, and built to function reliably under all normal conditions. The idea that one would simply come undone during a routine drive was not just unusual, it was virtually impossible. I resecured the latch and completed the delivery, but the incident troubled me deeply. That evening, I called our equipment maintenance specialist and described what had happened. He was as puzzled as I was, asking detailed questions about road conditions, vehicle performance, and the specifics of the latch mechanism. When I mentioned that the failure had occurred near mile marker 14, he was quiet for a long moment. "Rita," he finally said, "you've been making this drive for years. Have you ever looked into the history of that stretch of road? I hadn't, but his questions stayed with me through a restless night. The next morning, I drove to the county clerk's office and requested traffic incident reports for State Route 27, specifically the area around mile marker 14. What I found changed my understanding of that road forever. 20 years ago, almost to the day, a single car accident had occurred at mile marker 14. The victim was Sarah Chen, age 28, who had been driving home from her job at the county hospital when her car left the roadway and struck a large oak tree. The impact was fatal, and the cause of the accident was never definitively determined. Weather conditions were clear, the road was dry, and there were no signs of mechanical failure or impairment. Sarah Chen was Margaret Chen's daughter. I sat in the clerk's office parking lot for 20 minutes, studying the accident report and trying to process what I'd learned. Sarah had died on October 15, 2003. I had transported Margaret on October 14, 2023, exactly 20 years and 1 day later. The implications were disturbing enough on their own, but what haunted me most was the timing. Margaret's casket latch had come undone at the precise location where her daughter had died 2 decades earlier. The mechanical impossibility of that failure, combined with the inexplicable slowing I'd experienced at mile marker 14, suggested something beyond coincidence. I drove back to Meadowbrook Services and pulled Margaret's file. Her obituary mentioned Sarah, describing her as predeceased by her beloved daughter, but provided no details about the circumstances of Sarah's death. Margaret's family had requested a closed casket service, which wasn't unusual for someone her age, but now I wondered if there were other reasons for their decision. That afternoon, I called Margaret's son-in-law and asked if I could speak with him privately. We met at a coffee shop near the funeral home, and I carefully explained what had happened during transport. I didn't mention the accident report or my research. I simply described the mechanical failure and asked if there was anything about Margaret or her family history that might be relevant. His response confirmed my worst suspicions. Margaret had never fully recovered from Sarah's death, he told me. She'd visited the accident site regularly for years, leaving flowers and sitting in her car for hours at a time. The family had eventually convinced her to stop these visits, but she'd continued to talk about Sarah daily, often expressing guilt that she hadn't been able to protect her daughter. Margaret always said she wanted to be with Sarah again, he said quietly. We thought she meant in heaven, eventually. But in her final weeks, she kept asking about that stretch of road, wondering if Sarah was still waiting there. I haven't made a Hillcrest transport since that conversation. I've requested reassignment to other routes, citing scheduling conflicts and personal preference. My supervisor was understanding, perhaps more understanding than I expected, which makes me wonder if other drivers have had similar experiences on State Route 27. But sometimes, driving other routes to other cemeteries, I think about mile marker 14 and what might still be happening there. I think about Margaret and Sarah, about 20 years of separation, and the possibility that some bonds transcend death itself. And I wonder if every road has places that pull at you, places where the past refuses to let go, where love and loss create their own gravity that slows you down just long enough to remember that some journeys never really end. Some cars develop personalities after enough years on the road, but mine developed something else entirely. My name is Eddie, and I've been driving for Covenant Funeral Services for 22 years. In that time, I've operated 12 different hearses, from the older Cadillac Superiors that rode like boats to the modern Lincoln MKTs that feel more like luxury SUVs. Each vehicle had its quirks, a tendency to pull left, a rattle in the dashboard, a radio that only worked on certain frequencies. You learn to accommodate these mechanical personalities, to work with them rather than against them. But the 2018 Lincoln Navigator that I've been assigned for the past 3 years is different. It doesn't just have quirks, it has behaviors that make no mechanical sense, patterns that suggest something beyond routine wear and tear, and all of these behaviors center around the passenger seat. The first incident occurred during a transport to Riverside Cemetery in late September. I was carrying Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman, an 85-year-old retired seamstress whose family had requested a simple graveside service. The drive was routine clear weather, light traffic, the kind of peaceful journey that allows families to process their grief without additional stress. About halfway to the cemetery, the passenger door ajar warning light began flickering on the dashboard. I glanced over at the passenger door, which was clearly and securely closed, then checked the light again. It continued to flash intermittently, a soft amber glow that appeared every few seconds before fading away. I made a mental note to have the vehicle inspected, but didn't think much of it at the time. Electrical gremlins are common in modern vehicles, and a faulty door sensor seemed like a minor issue. After Mrs. Kellerman's service, I drove back to Covenant and mentioned the warning light to our maintenance supervisor, Carl. He's been working on funeral vehicles for 30 years and has seen every possible mechanical problem. Carl checked the door sensors, tested the wiring, and ran a full diagnostic on the electrical system. Everything appeared normal. "Probably just a loose connection," he said, handing me back the keys. "Sometimes these sensors get finicky when the weather changes. Keep an eye on it and let me know if it gets worse." But it did get worse, in ways that defied Carl's explanation. The warning light continued to flicker during subsequent transports, always at seemingly random intervals. But after a few weeks, I began to notice a pattern. The light only activated when I was carrying certain passengers, never during empty drives or routine maintenance trips, only during actual funeral transports, and it seemed to prefer passengers who had died alone. Mr. Harrison, who had lived as a hermit for the last 15 years of his life. Mrs. Chen, whose body wasn't discovered for 3 days. The teenage girl whose parents had been traveling when she overdosed. Each time I transported someone who had died in solitude, the passenger door warning light would begin its strange dance across my dashboard. By November, the phenomenon had evolved beyond simple warning lights. I started hearing sounds from the passenger seat, distinct click of a seatbelt being fastened, clear and unmistakable, occurring at random moments during transport. The first time it happened, I actually pulled over and checked the seatbelt mechanism, thinking perhaps the buckle was faulty and clicking on its own. But the seatbelt was unbuckled and showed no signs of movement. The clicking sound became a regular feature of my drives, always emanating from the empty passenger seat. Sometimes it would happen once during a transport, sometimes multiple times. I began to anticipate it, tensing slightly whenever I heard the familiar metallic snap, but I never mentioned it to the families. They had enough to process, without worrying about mechanical anomalies in their loved one's final ride. December brought a new development that was harder to ignore. The air conditioning system began turning itself to maximum cold during transports, regardless of the outside temperature or my control settings. I would set the climate control to a comfortable 72 degrees, and within minutes, it would adjust itself to the coldest possible setting. The passenger side vents would blow Arctic air with unusual force, creating a localized cold zone that made the right side of my body uncomfortably chilly. I had Carl examine the climate control system multiple times. He replaced sensors, checked the control module, and even swapped out the entire HVAC unit with one from another vehicle. The problem persisted. Eventually, I started leaving the passenger window cracked open about an inch, telling families it was for ventilation. In reality, it was to balance the inexplicable cold air that poured from the passenger vents. The combination of these phenomena, the warning light, the seatbelt clicks, the aggressive air conditioning, created an atmosphere in the hearse that I can only describe as expectant. As if the passenger seat was occupied by someone I couldn't see, someone who was adjusting their seatbelt and requesting a cooler temperature for the journey. The situation reached its unsettling climax during a transport in early January, carrying Mr. Robert Finch to Pine Hill Cemetery. Mr. Blank Somsom's quoting. Finch had been 73, a widower who had died of a heart attack in his kitchen. His body hadn't been discovered for nearly a week, and the family was clearly struggling with guilt about his isolation. The drive to Pine Hill takes about 40 minutes through rural countryside, and I was about 20 minutes into the journey when all the familiar signs began. The passenger door warning light started its rhythmic flashing. The seatbelt clicked once, then twice, and the air conditioning switched to its coldest setting. But this time, something else happened. I heard breathing. Not from the back of the hearse where Mr. Finch's casket rested, but from the passenger seat beside me. Slow, steady breaths that fogged the passenger window, despite the absence of any visible person. The breathing was barely audible over the vehicle's normal sounds, but unmistakable once I noticed it. Each exhale created a small patch of condensation on the glass, circular marks that appeared and faded in a steady rhythm. I kept my eyes on the road and tried to maintain my composure, but my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. The breathing continued for perhaps 5 minutes, accompanied by the occasional seatbelt click and the relentless flow of cold air from the passenger vents. Then, as we approached the Pine Hill gates, everything stopped. The warning light went dark, the air conditioning returned to normal, and the breathing ceased. I delivered Mr. Finch to his final rest without incident, but the experience left me deeply shaken. During the graveside service, I found myself studying the faces of his family members, wondering if any of them had sensed their father's presence during the journey. But they showed no signs of awareness, focused entirely on their grief and the minister's words. That evening, I requested a meeting with our operations manager and explained what had been happening with the Lincoln Navigator. I kept my account factual and professional, focusing on the mechanical anomalies rather than their supernatural implications. To my surprise, he listened without skepticism and made some notes in my personnel file. "Eddie," he said when I finished, "you're not the first driver to report unusual experiences with funeral vehicles. Sometimes these cars absorb something from their passengers, especially the ones who died alone. We can transfer you to a different vehicle if you'd prefer." I accepted the transfer immediately, and the Lincoln Navigator was reassigned to our backup fleet. But I've learned that some experiences follow you regardless of which vehicle you drive. Even in my new hearse, I find myself glancing at the passenger seat during transports, listening for the sound of breathing, watching for the telltale fog on the windows. And sometimes, just sometimes, I still hear that seatbelt click. The families never notice, of course. They're focused on their own farewells, their own grief. But I've come to understand that funeral work involves more than simply transporting the deceased. Sometimes, we're also carrying those who refuse to travel alone, those who've been waiting for someone to sit beside them on their final journey. I still crack the passenger window during transports, not for ventilation, but because I've learned that some passengers prefer a little fresh air on the ride. There are roads that exist only when you need them most, though you'll never find them on any map you check later. My name is Carmen, and I've been driving the night shift for Eternal Rest Funeral Home for 7 years. Night transports are different from daytime runs, quieter, more contemplative, with fewer witnesses to the strange things that can happen when the world sleeps. I prefer the solitude, the way darkness softens the harsh edges of grief and gives families space to process their loss without the scrutiny of daylight. Most of my routes are routine, well-traveled paths between our facility and the dozen cemeteries we serve. I know every traffic light, every potential delay, every shortcut that can save 5 minutes when families are running late. My GPS unit is a reliable Garmin that I've used for 3 years without any significant problems. It knows these roads as well as I do, and it's never led me astray. Until I started transporting the solitary ones. That's what I call them in my mind, the people who died alone. Not by choice, necessarily, but through circumstance. The elderly widow whose body wasn't discovered for a week. The bachelor who suffered a heart attack in his empty apartment. The teenager whose parents were traveling when she overdosed. These cases require particular sensitivity, and I've always taken pride in giving them the same dignity and care as any other passenger. But about 6 months ago, something changed. When transporting these particular clients, my GPS began suggesting routes I'd never seen before. The first time it happened was during a midnight transport of Mr. Harold Vance to Greenwood Cemetery. Mr. Vance had been 74, a retired librarian who lived alone after his wife's death 5 years earlier. His neighbor had found him collapsed in his garden, apparently having been there for several days. I loaded Mr. Vance's modest casket and programmed Greenwood Cemetery into my GPS, the same destination I'd entered dozens of times before. But instead of directing me down the familiar Maple Street route, the screen displayed an alternate path. I'd never seen, a series of turns that led to something called Old Mill Road. I assumed it was suggesting a new route to avoid construction or traffic, though it seemed odd for midnight on a Tuesday. But the GPS was insistent, recalculating each time I attempted to follow my usual path, so I decided to trust the technology and follow the suggested detour. Old Mill Road turned out to be a narrow country lane that wound through dense woodland I hadn't known existed in our area. The pavement was older, rougher than modern roads, with the kind of worn asphalt that suggested decades of minimal maintenance. Ancient oak trees formed a canopy overhead, their branches so thick they blocked most of the moonlight. The road seemed to stretch much longer than it should have, considering we were still within the city limits. I drove for what felt like 20 minutes through unbroken forest, following the GPS's calm directions, wondering why I'd never noticed this road before. But the strangest part wasn't the road itself, it was what I heard during the drive. Soft humming was coming from the back of the hearse. Not mechanical humming from the engine or air conditioning, but the gentle, melodic humming of a human voice. It was barely audible over the vehicle's normal sounds, but unmistakable once I noticed it. The tune was something classical, though I couldn't identify the specific piece. It had the measured, contemplative quality of a lullaby or hymn. I glanced at the rearview mirror, but Mr. Vance's casket sat undisturbed and properly secured. The humming continued for the entire length of Old Mill Road, stopping only when the GPS directed me back onto familiar streets near Greenwood Cemetery. Despite the long detour through unknown territory, I arrived at exactly the scheduled time. The next morning, I tried to locate Old Mill Road on various maps and GPS systems. It didn't appear on any of them. I even drove back to the area where the detour had begun, but found only the standard route to Greenwood Cemetery. No sign of the wooded lane or the entrance I'd taken the night before. I mentioned the incident to my supervisor, Maria, who's been with Eternal Rest for 15 years. She listened without skepticism and made a note in her logbook, but didn't seem particularly surprised. "Carmen," she said, "sometimes the night shift shows us things the day shift never sees. As long as you're arriving on time and the families are satisfied, I wouldn't worry about GPS quirks." But it wasn't just a quirk. Over the following months, the pattern repeated with disturbing consistency. Every time I transported someone who had died alone, my GPS would suggest the Old Mill Road detour. And every time, I would hear that same gentle humming from the back of the hearse. Mrs. Elizabeth Santos, who had lived as a recluse for the last decade of her life. During her transport, the humming was accompanied by what sounded like soft Spanish singing. Words I couldn't quite make out, but that carried the rhythm of a traditional folk song. Timothy Chen, a 28-year-old programmer who had died of an overdose in his studio apartment. His journey was marked by humming that sounded younger, more contemporary, with the subtle beat of music I might have heard in nightclubs. Each passenger seemed to bring their own variation of the phenomenon, but the constant was that Old Mill Road and the accompanying sounds. The detour always added at least 30 minutes to my travel time, yet I continued to arrive precisely when expected. Families never complained about delays, never checked their watches impatiently, never seemed aware that anything unusual had occurred. The most unsettling transport occurred 3 weeks ago, when I carried Sarah Mitchell to Riverside Cemetery. Sarah had been 42, a nurse who had worked night shifts at the county hospital before dying alone in her apartment from a sudden aneurysm. Her body hadn't been discovered for 5 days. The GPS directed me onto Old Mill Road as usual, and the familiar humming began within minutes. But this time, the sound was different. Instead of a single voice, I heard what seemed like a chorus, multiple voices humming in harmony, creating a complex melody that filled the back of the hearse. The harmonies were beautiful but deeply melancholy, like a requiem being performed by invisible mourners. As I drove through the dark forest, I found myself fighting back tears, overwhelmed by the sadness and loneliness that seemed to permeate the music. It was as if Sarah's journey had attracted others like her, solitary souls who had joined her for this final passage. When the humming finally stopped and I emerged onto familiar roads near Riverside Cemetery, I sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes, trying to compose myself. The experience had been emotionally devastating in a way I couldn't fully explain. During Sarah's graveside service the next morning, I noticed something that confirmed my suspicions about what was happening on Old Mill Road. As the minister spoke about Sarah's life and service to others, he mentioned that she had always hummed while working, that her colleagues remembered her for the gentle melodies that had brought comfort to patients during difficult nights. I realized then that Old Mill Road wasn't just a detour, it was a gathering place, a route where those who had died alone could find companionship for their final journey. The humming wasn't random, it was personal, meaningful, drawn from the lives and personalities of my passengers. I haven't tried to avoid the detours. When my GPS suggests Old Mill Road, I follow its directions and listen to whatever music my passengers choose to share. The families never know about these extended journeys, these moments of connection between the living and the dead. But I know, and I think that's enough. Sometimes, when I'm driving the regular daytime routes with more conventional passengers, I find myself missing the detours. There's something profound about those midnight drives through impossible forests, something that makes the work feel less like transportation and more like ministry. The night shift has taught me that some roads exist only for those who need them, and some passengers require more than just a ride to their destination. They need witnesses to their final song, companions for their last journey, someone to hear their voice one more time before the silence of eternity. And sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I catch myself humming along. There are some things you learn not to look at, even when they're looking back at you. My name is Thomas, and I've been driving hearses for Highland Memorial Services for 18 years. In that time, I've transported over 3,000 souls to their final rest, from newborns who never had a chance to centenarians who'd lived through nearly everything history could offer. Each transport is a sacred responsibility, a final service that requires dignity, respect, and absolute professionalism. I take pride in my work, in the quiet moments of reflection that each journey provides. Driving a hearse isn't just transportation, it's a moving meditation, a chance for families to process their grief while knowing their loved one is in capable, caring hands. The role demands emotional stability, mechanical precision, and an understanding that you're carrying more than just physical remains. You're carrying memories, love, and the weight of lives fully lived. My route knowledge is encyclopedic after nearly 2 decades on these roads. I know which cemeteries prefer morning arrivals, which funeral homes have loading dock complications, and which routes provide the smoothest ride for grieving families following behind. My Hearse 2019 Cadillac XT Sis maintained meticulously, detailed weekly, and equipped with all the modern conveniences that make difficult days slightly easier for those I serve. But about 8 months ago, something changed in the way I experienced these transports. It started with Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, a 91-year-old former teacher who had passed peacefully in her sleep at Sunset Manor. Her family had requested a simple transport from our facility to Graceland Cemetery, and I'd loaded her ornate bronze casket with the same care I'd shown thousands of times before. The drive to Graceland takes approximately 25 minutes through mixed suburban and rural areas. I was perhaps 10 minutes into the journey, maintaining the respectful pace that families expect, when I glanced in my rearview mirror to check the road behind me. What I saw defied every rational explanation I could construct. Mrs. Whitfield was sitting upright in the back of the hearse, looking directly at me through the mirror. Not physically, of course. Her casket remained sealed and properly secured in the cargo area, undisturbed from its original position. But in the reflection of my rearview mirror, she appeared as clearly as if she were a living passenger. She looked exactly as she had in the photographs. Her family had shared silver hair neatly arranged, wearing what appeared to be a blue dress with small pearl buttons. Her expression was peaceful, almost amused, and she was looking directly into the mirror, meeting my eyes with a gentle smile. I blinked hard, adjusted the mirror angle, and looked again. The reflection remained unchanged. Mrs. Whitfield continued to sit calmly in the back seat, her hands folded in her lap, watching me drive with what seemed like approval. When I turned around to look directly into the cargo area, I saw only her closed casket, exactly as I'd loaded it. The phenomenon lasted for perhaps 2 minutes before fading away, leaving only the normal reflection of an empty cargo area. I completed the transport without incident, delivered Mrs. Whitfield to her final rest, and said nothing to her family about what I'd experienced. They deserved to focus on their grief, not my apparent psychological symptoms. That evening, I scheduled a comprehensive eye exam and discussed the incident with my physician, Dr. Martinez. She conducted thorough tests, checked for signs of fatigue, stress, or medical conditions that might cause hallucinations. Everything came back normal. Dr. Martinez suggested that the emotional demands of funeral work might occasionally produce unusual perceptual experiences, especially during times of personal stress or fatigue. I accepted her explanation and resolved to monitor my mental health more carefully. But the explanations became harder to maintain as the pattern continued. Mr. James Harrison, a 67-year-old mechanic, appeared in my mirror 3 weeks later during his transport to Riverside Cemetery. He was wearing coveralls and seemed to be enjoying the ride, occasionally nodding as if appreciating my driving technique. Mrs. Dorothy Chen showed up during her journey to Pine Hill, dressed in what looked like traditional Chinese clothing, smiling peacefully as she watched the familiar roads pass by. Each reflection was distinct, personal, and remarkably detailed. The deceased appeared as they might have in life, healthy, comfortable, and seemingly content with their final journey. They never seemed distressed or frightening, just present, watchful, and somehow grateful for the care they were receiving. By the fourth incident, I'd developed a strategy of simply not looking in the rearview mirror during transports. I used my side mirrors to monitor traffic, relied on my extensive route knowledge to navigate, and kept my eyes focused firmly on the road ahead. But even when I wasn't looking, I could feel their presence. The sensation of being watched, of carrying a passenger who was somehow aware and engaged with the journey. The phenomenon seemed to occur with roughly 1 in 10 transports, with no obvious pattern I could identify. Age, gender, cause of death, family circumstances, none of these factors predicted when I might encounter a reflection. Some journeys proceeded normally, while others were accompanied by these gentle, watchful presences. The most unsettling incident occurred during a transport 6 weeks ago. I was carrying Mr. Robert Sterling, a 45-year-old father of 3 who had died suddenly of a heart attack. His family was devastated, struggling with the shock of losing someone so young and vital. The funeral had been particularly emotional, with his children barely able to compose themselves. About halfway to Eternal Rest Cemetery, I became aware of the familiar sensation of being watched. Despite my resolution to avoid the rearview mirror, something compelled me to glance up. Mr. D. Sterling was there, but this time he wasn't alone. Sitting beside him was a woman I recognized from the funeral photograph—she's wife, Sarah, who had died of cancer 2 years earlier. They were holding hands, both smiling, both looking directly at me with expressions of profound peace and gratitude. Sarah nodded slightly, as if acknowledging my role in bringing them together. The reflection was so vivid, so emotionally charged, that I had to pull over to compose myself. I sat in the hearse for several minutes, overwhelmed by the implications of what I'd witnessed. When I finally continued the journey, both figures remained visible until we reached the cemetery gates. At Mr. Sterling's graveside service, his eldest daughter mentioned that her father had never stopped missing her mother, that he'd spoken constantly about wanting to be with Sarah again. The family found comfort in believing they were finally reunited, though they had no idea how literally true that might be. Since that experience, I've adopted a different approach to these reflections. I no longer try to avoid them or explain them away. When I sense the familiar presence of a passenger, I simply acknowledge it quietly and continue my duties with extra care and attention. I've come to understand that these moments represent something beyond my comprehension but within my responsibility. The reflections have taught me that my role extends beyond simply transporting physical remains. I'm also carrying hopes, memories, and connections that transcend death itself. Some passengers, it seems, remain aware enough to appreciate the dignity and respect they're receiving during their final earthly journey. I still don't look in the rearview mirror during transports, not because I fear what I might see, but because I've learned that some experiences are too sacred to scrutinize. The presence of these passengers is gift enough. I don't need visual confirmation to know they're there. And sometimes, when I feel their attention particularly strongly, I find myself driving with extra care, taking corners more gently, choosing routes with better scenery. Not because it makes any practical difference, but because I've learned that some journeys deserve to be savored even when they're the last one you'll ever take. The families never know about their loved ones' final moments of awareness, their last opportunity to observe the world they're leaving behind. But I know, and I think that's enough. Some secrets are meant to be carried quietly, like passengers who watch the road ahead with grateful, peaceful eyes. Music has a way of finding you, even when you're not looking for it. My name is Dolores, and I've been a transport specialist for Serenity Funeral Services for 11 years. The work suits my temperament: quiet, methodical, requiring attention to detail and respect for the profound moments families experience during their darkest hours. I've always found comfort in routine, in the predictable rhythms of loading, transport, and delivery that structure each day. My Hearse is a 2020 Cadillac XT5, equipped with all the modern amenities that make the job easier and more dignified. The sound system is particularly good, a premium audio package that I keep tuned to Classical 95.7, a local station that plays gentle, appropriate music for the solemn nature of my work. Chopin, Bach, Mozart, composers who understood that beauty and sadness often walk hand in hand. The classical music serves multiple purposes. It creates a peaceful atmosphere for families, following in procession, provides a calming backdrop for my own thoughts during long drives, and ensures that nothing inappropriate or jarring will intrude on these sacred journeys. In 11 years, I'd never had any issues with the radio system, never encountered any technical problems that disrupted the professional atmosphere I worked to maintain. Until 3 months ago, when I began transporting passengers who apparently had their own musical preferences. The first incident occurred during a transport of Mrs. Helen Patterson to Riverside Cemetery. Mrs. Helen Patterson had been 86, a retired music teacher who had passed quietly in her sleep at Meadowbrook Assisted Living. Her family described her as someone who had lived for music, who had taught piano lessons until she was 78 and had filled her room with recordings of her favorite songs. I had loaded Mrs. Patterson's casket and begun the drive to Riverside, with Classical 95.7 playing softly in the background as usual. About 10 minutes into the journey, the radio began to fade, the familiar strains of a Brahms piece dissolving into static. I assumed it was a signal. The route to Riverside passes through some rural areas where reception can be spotty. But instead of silence or white noise, another song began to emerge from the speakers. At first, it was so quiet I could barely make it out, just a whisper of melody beneath the static. Gradually, it became clearer, more distinct, until I could identify it as "The Way You Look Tonight," performed by Frank Sinatra in that warm, intimate style that had made him legendary. The song played at a volume just loud enough for me to recognize it, never intrusive or inappropriate, but unmistakably present. It had the quality of music drifting from another room, familiar but distant. When I checked the radio display, it still showed Classical 95.7, but the frequency numbers flickered occasionally, as if the tuner was struggling to lock onto the signal. "The Way You Look Tonight" played for the entire remainder of the journey, ending precisely as I pulled through the gates of Riverside Cemetery. The moment I stopped the hearse, Classical 95.7 resumed its normal programming, as if nothing unusual had occurred. During Mrs. Patterson's graveside service, her son mentioned that The Way You Look Tonight had been his mother's favorite song, the one she'd hummed while teaching piano lessons and played whenever she felt lonely. He said she'd often told students that it was the most beautiful love song ever written, that it captured something essential about seeing beauty in another person. I said nothing about the radio incident, but it stayed with me through the following days. That evening, I spent an hour scanning through radio frequencies, trying to locate the station that had played the Sinatra song. I found nothing but static and distant signals from stations hundreds of miles away. The phenomenon might have remained an isolated curiosity if it hadn't happened again 2 weeks later. I was transporting Mr. David Chen, a 54-year-old engineer who had died of a heart attack while working late at his office. His family had requested a simple transport to Graceland Cemetery, and I had begun the journey with my radio tuned to its usual classical programming. Once again, about 10 minutes into the drive, the signal began to fade, and another song emerged from the static. This time it was Hotel California by the Eagles, playing at that same whisper, quiet volume, just loud enough for me to identify the distinctive guitar work and lyrics. The song played for the entire journey, ending precisely as we reached the cemetery gates. At Mr. Chen's service, his wife mentioned that he'd been obsessed with 70s rock music, that Hotel California had been his absolute favorite, and that he'd played it constantly during their college years. She said he'd claimed it was the perfect song, mysterious, beautiful, and somehow timeless. By the third incident, I had to accept that something beyond coincidence was occurring. Mrs. Margaret Flores, a 73-year-old retired librarian, was accompanied by Cielito Lindo, a traditional Mexican folk song that her daughter later described as her mother's childhood lullaby. The pattern was unmistakable. The radio would retune itself to an unknown frequency, play a song that held deep personal meaning for the deceased, and return to normal programming exactly when we reached our destination. The volume was always perfect, never loud enough to be disruptive, never so quiet that I couldn't identify the music. It was as if someone was carefully adjusting the levels to ensure I could hear and recognize each song without being overwhelmed by the experience. Over the following weeks, I transported a jazz enthusiast who was serenaded by Miles Davis, a country music fan who heard Patsy Cline, and a classical violinist whose journey was accompanied by her own recording of Bach's Partita No. 2. Each song was personally meaningful, often mentioned by family members during funeral services as having special significance to their loved one. I began to anticipate these musical interludes, finding myself listening carefully during each transport for the first signs of static that announced an incoming song. The experience was never frightening or unpleasant, if anything. It felt like being entrusted with something private and precious, a final expression of personality from passengers who could no longer speak for themselves. The most powerful incident occurred last month during the transport of 17-year-old Amanda Walsh, who had died in a car accident on her way home from a school dance. Her family was devastated, struggling with the senseless loss of someone so young and full of promise. As we drove toward Pine Hill Cemetery, the radio began its familiar fade into static. But this time, instead of a single song, I heard what sounded like a mixtape, multiple songs, blending seamlessly into one another, each playing for just a minute or two before transitioning to the next. There was Taylor Swift, followed by Billie Eilish, then an older song I recognized as Don't Stop Believin' by Journey. The music had the energy and eclecticism of a teenager's playlist, jumping between genres and decades with the fearless enthusiasm of youth. Despite the sadness of the circumstances, I found myself smiling at the musical choices, imagining Amanda curating this final mixtape for her last journey. The music played continuously for the 40-minute drive to Pine Hill, ending with Somewhere Over the Rainbow, just as we pulled through the cemetery gates. During the service, Amanda's best friend mentioned that she'd been working on a playlist for their graduation party, mixing her favorite songs from different eras. She said Amanda had believed that good music could transcend any barrier, including time and space. I've stopped trying to locate the mysterious radio station during my off hours. The music exists only during these specific transports, only for these particular passengers who seem to have something they want to share. I've come to think of my hearse as a moving jukebox, a final venue where the deceased can perform their favorite songs one last time. The families never know about these private concerts, these moments when their loved ones seem to reach across the boundary between life and death to share something beautiful. But I know, and I think that's enough. Sometimes, when I'm driving empty routes or heading home after a long day, I find myself humming the songs I've heard during these transports. Each melody carries the memory of a person, a life, a story that deserves to be remembered. The radio has taught me that music truly is universal, that some songs are too powerful to be silenced by death itself. And occasionally, when the classical station fades to static during routine drives, I find myself hoping for one more song, one more passenger who wants to share their music with someone willing to listen. Some calls come from places that no longer exist, for people who stopped waiting long ago. My name is Vincent, and I've been working the overnight shift for Mercy Funeral Services for 9 years. The night shift is different from daytime operations, quieter, more contemplative, with fewer staff and longer periods of solitude. Most of our overnight work involves pickups from hospitals, nursing homes, and private residences where death has occurred during the dark hours, when families prefer privacy and dignity over daytime scrutiny. I've always appreciated the responsibility that comes with being the first professional to care for the deceased, the person who begins their journey from the place of death to their final rest. It's sacred work that requires compassion, attention to detail, and absolute reliability. Families trust us to handle their most vulnerable moments with grace and professionalism. Our dispatch system is straightforward and efficient. Calls come through a digital system that logs every pickup request, assigns it to available drivers, and maintains detailed records for billing and coordination purposes. Each call includes the deceased's name, pickup address, destination facility, and any special instructions from families or medical staff. I receive these assignments on my mobile device and respond according to protocol, maintaining detailed logbooks for every transport. In 9 years of overnight work, I'd never encountered any significant problems with the dispatch system. The technology is reliable, the procedures are clear, and the coordination between dispatch and drivers is generally seamless. Night shift supervisors are available by phone for any complications, and our response times are carefully monitored to ensure families receive prompt, professional service. But 6 months ago, something began happening that challenged my understanding of how our system works. It started with a call that came through at 2:15 on a Tuesday morning in November. My mobile device chimed with a new assignment, pickup at 1723 Elmwood Street for a Mrs. Dorothy Hamilton, age 79, deceased at 11:45 the previous evening. The destination was listed as our main facility, with no special instructions noted. I entered the assignment in my logbook, programmed the address into my GPS, and began the drive to Elmwood Street. The route took me through an older residential neighborhood that I'd visited many times over the years. But when I arrived at 1723 Elmwood Street, I found only an empty lot. Not a house with the lights off, or a vacant property waiting for salience. Actual empty lot, overgrown with weeds and scattered with debris that suggested the building had been demolished years earlier. There was no structure, no mailbox, no indication that anyone had lived there recently, let alone died there the previous evening. I double-checked the address on my device and in my logbook. Both showed 1723 Elmwood Street clearly. I called dispatch to report the discrepancy, but the overnight supervisor had no record of any assignment to that address. According to their system, my last pickup had been 4 hours earlier at Riverside Hospital. Confused but following protocol, I remained at the location for exactly 11 minutes, the standard wait time for problematic addresses, before receiving a call that the pickup had been canceled due to address verification issues. The supervisor apologized for the confusion, and suggested there might have been a clerical error in the system. I completed my logbook entry, noting the canceled pickup, and continued with my shift, but the incident troubled me more than it should have. In 9 years of funeral work, I'd never encountered an address that simply didn't exist, and I couldn't understand how such a fundamental error could occur in our normally reliable system. The second incident happened 3 weeks later, another overnight assignment, this time to 842 Maple Avenue for a Mr. 4, James Patterson, age 67, who had allegedly died of a heart attack at his home. When I arrived at the address, I found another empty lot, this one clearly marked with a future development site sign, indicating the previous structure had been demolished 6 months earlier. Again, dispatch had no record of the assignment. Again, I waited exactly 11 minutes before the pickup was mysteriously canceled. And again, my logbook showed the address and details written clearly in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of writing them. By the fourth occurrence, I began to suspect that something beyond clerical error was happening. Each phantom pickup followed the same pattern: a call that appeared legitimate on my device, an address that led to vacant or demolished property, exactly 11 minutes of waiting, and a cancellation that left no trace in the dispatch system. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the technical impossibility of the situation, it was the personal details of the supposed deceased. When I researched the names from these phantom calls, I discovered that they were real people who had actually died. But decades earlier, Mrs. Dorothy Hamilton had died in 1978. Mr. James Patterson had passed away in 1985. The addresses were correct for where they had lived, but the buildings had been demolished years after their deaths. Each phantom pickup seemed to represent someone who had died at home during an era when Mercy funeral services might have been called to handle their transport. But for reasons I couldn't determine, these calls were somehow echoing through time, reaching my dispatch system decades after the original need had passed. The phenomenon reached its most unsettling manifestation 3 weeks ago during a particularly quiet Thursday night. I received what appeared to be a standard pickup assignment. Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, age 84, deceased at her residence on 1915 Oak Street. The timestamp showed the death had occurred at 10:30 that evening. I drove to Oak Street and found the expected empty lot, now serving as an informal neighborhood park with a small playground and walking path. But this time, as I sat in my hearse waiting out the required 11 minutes, something extraordinary happened. For just a moment, perhaps 30 seconds, the empty lot shimmered and changed. In the dim glow of my headlights, I saw the ghost of a house, a modest 2-story Victorian with a wraparound porch and bay windows, complete in every detail down to the flower boxes and porch swing. The image was translucent but unmistakable, overlaying the empty lot like a double exposure photograph. Through the front window, I could see warm light and the silhouette of furniture. On the porch, barely visible in the pale glow, sat an elderly woman in a rocking chair. She was looking directly at my hearse, and when our eyes met, she raised her hand in a small wave of acknowledgement. Then my phone rang with the cancellation call, and the vision faded, leaving only the empty lot and playground equipment. My hands were shaking as I wrote the incident report in my logbook, trying to capture what I'd witnessed without sounding like I'd suffered a psychological breakdown. That evening, I researched Mrs. Eleanor Walsh and discovered she had indeed lived at 1915 Oak Street, where she had died peacefully in her sleep on a Thursday night in October of 1993. The house had been demolished in 2007 to make way for the neighborhood park. I've continued to receive these phantom pickups, roughly once every 2 weeks, always following the same pattern. Each call represents someone who died at home decades ago, someone who might have waited for Mercy funeral services to collect them, but was somehow forgotten in the transition between life and death. I no longer report these incidents to dispatch, and I've stopped trying to research the names of the supposed deceased. Instead, I simply drive to each address, sit respectfully for 11 minutes, and acknowledge whatever presence might still be waiting there. It seems like the least I can do for people who may have been overlooked by the original systems designed to care for them. The phantom pickups have taught me that some calls transcend time, that some people wait longer than others for the dignity and respect they deserve in death. My logbook now contains dozens of these impossible addresses, written in my own hand but with no memory of writing them. And sometimes, when I'm driving the empty roads during the darkest hours of night, I wonder how many other calls are still echoing through the years. How many people are still waiting for someone to acknowledge their need for final care and transport to whatever rest they've been seeking all this time? Cold has a way of seeping into places it doesn't belong, carrying messages written in frost that disappear before you can read them completely. My name is Lucia, and I've been driving medical transports for compassionate care services for 14 years. Medical transport work differs from standard funeral services. We handle transfers from hospitals to funeral homes, between facilities, and occasionally from private residences to morgues when families request professional assistance. The work requires medical knowledge, sensitivity to family dynamics, and the ability to maintain dignity during some of the most difficult moments people experience. My vehicle is a specialized medical transport van, designed specifically for moving the deceased with appropriate temperature control, secure mounting systems, and privacy features that protect both the passengers and the families we serve. The climate control system is particularly sophisticated, capable of maintaining precise temperatures regardless of external conditions, essential for preserving dignity and preventing deterioration during longer transports. I've always prided myself on maintaining optimal conditions in my vehicle. The temperature is kept at a consistent 68 degrees, the humidity controlled, and the air circulation designed to prevent any unpleasant odors that might distress families following in procession. After 14 years of transports, I know every quirk of my vehicle's systems, every sound that indicates normal operation, and every warning sign that suggests mechanical issues. But 18 months ago, something began happening that defied every rational explanation I could construct about automotive climate control systems. The first incident occurred during a July transport from Riverside Hospital to Eternal Rest Funeral Home. The outside temperature was 92 degrees, typical for summer in our region, and my air conditioning was maintaining its usual comfortable 68 degrees. I was transporting Mrs. Catherine Walsh, an 87-year-old woman who had passed peacefully after a long battle with pneumonia. About 10 minutes into the 30-minute journey, I noticed my breath becoming visible in small puffs of vapor. At first, I thought something was wrong with my air conditioning. Perhaps the system had malfunctioned and was pumping out Arctic air. But when I checked the climate control display, it showed the normal 68 degrees. The temperature drop was dramatic and localized. While the dashboard and steering wheel remained warm to the touch, the air around me had become genuinely cold, cold enough that I could see my breath, cold enough that I instinctively reached for a jacket I didn't have. The phenomenon lasted for perhaps 5 minutes before gradually returning to normal, as if someone had slowly turned down an invisible thermostat. I had my vehicle inspected the next day. The technician found nothing wrong with the climate control system. The refrigerant levels were normal, and all electronic components tested within proper parameters. He suggested that perhaps I'd inadvertently adjusted the temperature controls during driving, though I was certain I hadn't touched them. The second incident occurred 3 weeks later during another hot summer day. This time, I was transporting Mr. Harold Chen, a 74-year-old retired teacher, from Mercy Hospital to his family's chosen funeral home. The same dramatic temperature drop occurred, but this time I noticed something additional. Frost was forming on the interior glass partition that separates the driver's area from the transport compartment. The frost appeared gradually, spreading across the glass in delicate patterns that looked almost like handwriting. Not random crystalline formations, but deliberate strokes and curves that suggested letters, words, perhaps even sentences being written by an invisible hand. The patterns were too intricate to be natural, too purposeful to be accidental. I pulled over safely and tried to photograph the frost patterns with my phone, but by the time I could focus the camera, they had already begun to fade. Within minutes, the temperature returned to normal and the glass was clear again, as if nothing unusual had occurred. The pattern established itself over the following months. During certain transports, perhaps 1/10 the temperature would drop dramatically. My breath would become visible, and frost would form on the partition glass in those strange, script-like patterns. The episodes always lasted between 5 and 10 minutes, always occurred during the middle portion of transport, and always resolved without explanation. I began keeping a heavy jacket in my front seat, telling colleagues it was for emergency situations or late-night calls. In reality, it was because I'd learned to recognize the early signs of an incoming temperature drop, a subtle shift in the air quality, a faint misting on the edge of my vision, a sense that the space around me was preparing for something extraordinary. The most unsettling aspect wasn't the cold itself, but the patterns in the frost. Each episode produced different formations, but they consistently resembled handwriting cursive script, block letters, sometimes what looked like signatures or brief messages. I began trying to memorize the patterns before they faded, sketching them in my logbook during rest stops. One particularly clear formation appeared to spell "Thank you" in elegant cursive across the entire width of the partition. Another time, I was certain I saw "Tell them" before the frost dissolved too quickly for me to make out any additional words. The messages, if that's what they were, seemed to be attempts at communication from passengers who could no longer speak for themselves. The most profound incident occurred last month during the transport of Maria Santos, a 42-year-old mother of 3 who had died unexpectedly of an aneurysm. Her family was devastated, struggling with the sudden loss of someone so vital and central to their lives. The funeral service had been particularly emotional, with her children barely able to contain their grief. As we traveled from the church to Graceland Cemetery, the familiar cold began to settle around me. But this time, the temperature drop was more severe than any I'd experienced, so cold that I could see ice crystals forming on my exhaled breath. So cold that I had to put on my jacket and gloves to maintain control of the vehicle. The frost on the partition glass formed more quickly and with greater complexity than ever before. Instead of scattered patterns, a continuous message appeared in clear, readable script. "Tell my children I'm still watching over them. The butterfly in the garden is my sign. They'll understand." The message remained visible for nearly a full minute, long enough for me to read it several times and commit it to memory. Then, as always, the temperature returned to normal, and the glass cleared, leaving no trace of what I'd witnessed. At the graveside service, Maria's youngest daughter, perhaps 8 years old, pointed to a butterfly that had landed on her mother's casket. "Look," she said to her siblings, "Mama sent us a butterfly. She always said butterflies were angels watching over us." The family found deep comfort in the butterfly's presence, interpreting it as a sign that their mother was somehow still with them. I said nothing about the message I'd received during transport, but the connection was unmistakable. Somehow, Maria had found a way to communicate reassurance to her children through frost patterns on my partition glass. Since that experience, I've approached these temperature drops differently. Instead of viewing them as mechanical anomalies or environmental curiosities, I've come to understand them as attempts at communication from passengers who have something important to say to their loved ones. I still keep detailed notes about each episode, sketching the frost patterns and recording any messages I can decipher. But I've also learned to honor these moments by paying careful attention, by treating them as the sacred communications they appear to be. The cold has taught me that some passengers require more than transportation. They need a witness, a translator, someone who can bridge the gap between their world and ours. The frost patterns have become a language I'm still learning to read, messages written in ice by hands I cannot see. And sometimes, when families mention signs or dreams or unusual experiences in the days following a funeral, I wonder if they're receiving the messages that began as frost patterns on my partition glass. Communications that somehow find their way from my vehicle to the hearts of those who need them most. Some journeys require stops that aren't on any map, visits to places that remember when remembering was all they had left. My name is Samuel, and I've been driving for Henderson's son's funeral home for 12 years. The work suits my temperament: methodical, respectful, requiring precision and reliability during family's most difficult moments. Most of my routes follow predictable patterns: funeral home to church for services, church to cemetery for burial, with occasional stops at family homes for viewings or private ceremonies. My responsibilities extend beyond simple transportation. I coordinate timing with clergy, communicate with cemetery staff, and ensure that every aspect of the final journey proceeds smoothly and respectfully. Families trust us to handle logistics so they can focus on grieving and honoring their loved ones. This trust is sacred, and I've built my reputation on never missing a scheduled arrival or causing unnecessary delays. My hearse is equipped with a professional-grade GPS navigation system, essential for reaching unfamiliar locations and calculating precise arrival times. The system has been reliable for years, guiding me efficiently through city traffic and rural roads with consistent accuracy. I maintain detailed route plans for every service, double-checking timing and noting any potential complications that might affect our schedule. Henderson Sons serves a wide area that includes both urban and rural communities, some with histories dating back to the 1800s. Many of our older clients request burial in family plots that have been used for generations, often in small rural cemeteries that aren't well marked or easily found. My navigation system has proven invaluable for locating these sometimes forgotten burial grounds. But 8 months ago, something began happening that challenged my understanding of both navigation technology and the geography of our service area. The first incident occurred during a service for Mrs. Helen Morrison, a 91-year-old retired schoolteacher who had requested burial in the family plot at Restwood Cemetery. The planned route was straightforward: Henderson Sons to First Methodist Church for the service, then directly to Restwood for burial. Total travel time approximately 40 minutes. I had programmed the route the evening before, as I always do, verifying the addresses and calculating timing to ensure we'd arrive at each location precisely when expected. The GPS showed the familiar 2-stop journey with clear directions and accurate time estimates. But during the drive from the church to the cemetery, something unexpected happened. Instead of directing me straight to Restwood, the navigation system announced a detour. The screen displayed a third waypoint I hadn't programmed, simply marked as Stop 3, with coordinates but no address or description. Assuming there might be road construction or traffic issues affecting the direct route, I followed the GPS instructions. The detour led me down a narrow country road I'd never traveled before, through dense woods that seemed untouched by modern development. After perhaps 10 minutes of driving, the navigation directed me to turn into what appeared to be an abandoned driveway. The driveway led to an old graveyard I'd never seen before, despite 12 years of working in the area. It was small, perhaps 50 graves, with weathered headstones dating back to the late 1800s. The grounds were overgrown but not completely neglected. Someone had been maintaining basic upkeep, keeping the worst of the vegetation from overwhelming the burial sites. My GPS announced destination reached and indicated I should wait for exactly 7 minutes before continuing to the final stop. I sat in the hearse, surrounded by the quiet cemetery, wondering why my navigation system had brought me here. There were no scheduled services, no maintenance activities, no apparent reason for this detour. After exactly 7 minutes, the GPS chimed and directed me to continue to Restwood Cemetery. The remainder of the journey proceeded normally, and we arrived precisely on time for Miss Morrison's burial service. The family never mentioned any delay, and the cemetery staff noted our punctual arrival. That evening, I tried to locate the mysterious graveyard using various mapping services and local records. The area where I'd been directed showed only empty woodland in satellite images, with no indication of a cemetery or burial ground. When I drove back to the location the next day during daylight hours, I found only the narrow country road, no driveway, no graveyard, no sign that I'd ever stopped there. The second incident occurred 3 weeks later, during a service for Mr. Robert Chen, a 76-year-old veteran, being buried at Memorial Gardens. Again, my navigation system added an unexpected third stop between the church and cemetery, leading me to what appeared to be a different abandoned graveyard. This one was larger, perhaps 100 graves, with military markers indicating it had served families with members in various wars from the Civil War through World War II. Again, I waited exactly 7 minutes in respectful silence before continuing to the scheduled burial. Again, we arrived precisely on time, and the family noticed no delays. By the fourth occurrence, I had to accept that something beyond navigation error was happening. Each phantom stop led to a different forgotten cemetery, each requiring exactly 7 minutes of waiting, each somehow coordinating with our schedule to ensure no delays or disruptions to planned services. The cemeteries varied in size, age, and apparent denomination, but they shared certain characteristics. They were all old, all somewhat overgrown, and all seemed to contain graves that had been neglected or forgotten. Some had elaborate Victorian monuments, others simple fieldstone markers, but all conveyed a sense of abandonment, of lives that were no longer being remembered or honored. I began to understand that these stops weren't random detours but purposeful visits, though I couldn't determine who or what was directing them. The navigation system was simply the mechanism being used to ensure I made these visits, to ensure that someone witnessed these forgotten places, where people had been laid to rest but were no longer mourned. The most profound incident occurred 6 weeks ago during the funeral of Mrs. Dorothy Walsh, an 84-year-old woman whose family had specifically requested that we visit the graves of her parents before proceeding to her own burial. They wanted to honor 3 generations being reunited in death. The scheduled route included the requested stop at Hillside Cemetery, where Mrs. Walsh's parents were buried, followed by the final journey to Peaceful Valley, where she would be interred. But as we left Hillside, my navigation system added its familiar third stop, directing me to yet another forgotten graveyard. This cemetery was different from the other smaller, more intimate, with graves that appeared to be from a single extended family spanning several generations. As I sat in the hearse during the required 7 minutes, I noticed that many of the headstones bore the surname Walsh. When I researched the Walsh family history later, I discovered that Mrs. Dorothy Walsh's ancestors had indeed been buried in a small family plot that had been abandoned when the surviving relatives moved west in the early 1900s. The cemetery had been forgotten for decades, its location lost when rural roads were reconfigured and property boundaries changed. Somehow, Mrs. Walsh's final journey had included a stop at the graves of her great-grandparents and earlier ancestors, a reunion that her family had never thought to request because they'd forgotten the cemetery existed. I've come to understand that these phantom stops serve a purpose beyond my comprehension but within my responsibility. I'm being guided to visit places where people were buried but are no longer remembered, to bear witness to their existence, and perhaps to carry some small acknowledgement of their lives forward. The families I serve never know about these additional stops, these moments when their loved ones' journeys extend beyond the scheduled route to include forgotten connections and abandoned burial grounds. But I know, and I think that's enough. Sometimes, when I'm sitting in those overgrown cemeteries during my required 7 minutes of waiting, I find myself reading the names on accessible headstones, silently acknowledging lives that ended decades ago but somehow still require recognition. The navigation system has taught me that some routes include destinations that aren't on any map, that some journeys need to honor connections that span generations. The third stop has become a sacred responsibility, a chance to ensure that no grave remains completely forgotten, that someone still witnesses the places where love once carved names in stone. The dead have one request they make over and over, and it's always the same 3 words. My name is Janet, and I've been coordinating funeral transports for Riverside Memorial Services for 16 years. Transport coordination involves more than just driving. I manage schedules, communicate with families, coordinate with cemetery staff, and ensure that every aspect of the final journey proceeds with dignity and respect. The work requires sensitivity to family dynamics, attention to protocol, and the ability to remain composed during emotionally charged situations. Most families appreciate having a consistent coordinator who understands their needs and can guide them through the practical aspects of funeral services. I've built relationships with clergy, cemetery staff, and funeral directors throughout our service area, creating a network that ensures smooth operations even during complex or challenging arrangements. My hearse is a 2021 Lincoln Navigator, equipped with all the modern conveniences that make difficult days slightly easier for grieving families. The vehicle is maintained meticulously, detailed weekly, and equipped with communication systems that keep me connected to our office and emergency services. After 16 years of this work, I can handle almost any situation that arises during transport. But there's one aspect of my job that I've never mentioned to supervisors, colleagues, or family members, something that began happening 2 years ago and has continued with unsettling consistency. During certain transports, I hear whispered requests from the back of the hearse. Not mechanical sounds or settling noises from the casket and its mounting system, but actual human whispers, clear and unmistakable, coming from the passenger compartment behind me. The voice is different each time, sometimes male, sometimes female, sometimes elderly, sometimes younger, but the message is always identical. Tell them I'm sorry. The first time it happened, I was transporting Mr. Edward Harrison from our facility to St. Mary's Church for his funeral service. Mr. Harrison had been 78, a retired businessman whose family relationships had been complicated by years of professional success that had come at the expense of personal connections. His son had mentioned during arrangement meetings that they'd had a falling out several years earlier and had never reconciled. About halfway to the church, I heard the whisper, so clear and distinct that I automatically glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see someone sitting behind me. The passenger compartment was empty, except for Mr. Harrison's sealed casket, properly secured and undisturbed. Tell them I'm sorry, the voice repeated, barely audible but unmistakably present. I said nothing, completed the transport, and delivered Mr. Harrison to his service. But something compelled me to remain nearby during the ceremony, lingering in the church vestibule instead of waiting in my vehicle, as I usually do. During the eulogy, Mr. Harrison's son spoke about regret, about words left unspoken, and forgiveness that had come too late. After the service, as families were leaving, Mr. Harrison's son approached me. He thanked me for my professionalism during a difficult time, then paused and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "Did you feel it too?" he asked quietly. "During the drive here, I had the strangest sense that my father was trying to tell me something." I said nothing, but nodded slightly. He nodded back, as if we'd shared an understanding that didn't require words. The second incident occurred 6 weeks later during the transport of Mrs. Catherine Walsh, an 83-year-old woman whose relationship with her daughter had been strained by disagreements about medical care and end-of-life decisions. Again, I heard the whispered request, "Tell them I'm sorry." Again, I found myself lingering after the service, and again, family members seemed to sense something beyond normal grief. Mrs. Walsh's daughter mentioned to relatives that she'd felt her mother's presence during the drive to the cemetery, that she'd experienced an overwhelming sense of peace and forgiveness. Over the following months, the pattern established itself with disturbing regularity. Perhaps one transport in 8 would be accompanied by the whispered plea, always from passengers whose relationships had been marked by conflict, misunderstanding, or unresolved tensions. And increasingly, family members would approach me after services with questions about whether I'd noticed anything unusual during transport. I never initiated these conversations, never suggested that anything supernatural was occurring, but something in my demeanor apparently invited confidence. Families would describe feeling their loved one's presence, hearing words of reconciliation, or experiencing sudden understanding about old conflicts. My mother always struggled to apologize, one daughter told me after her mother's service. But during the drive today, I could swear I heard her voice saying she was sorry for all the arguments about my marriage. It was exactly what I needed to hear. I began to understand that my role extended beyond physical transport. I was carrying messages from passengers who had found a way to communicate regret, forgiveness, and love to family members who needed to hear those words. The whispered requests weren't just random supernatural phenomena, they were purposeful communications that somehow reached their intended recipients. The most powerful incident occurred last month during the transport of Michael Torres, a 47-year-old father who had died of a heart attack after years of estrangement from his teenage son. The family dynamics were particularly painful, a divorce that had created lasting bitterness, accusations and counter-accusations that had poisoned relationships for years. During the drive to St. Joseph's Church, the whispered request came not once but repeatedly, "Tell them I'm sorry. Tell them I'm sorry. Tell them I'm sorry." The voice was urgent, desperate, filled with the kind of regret that comes from recognizing mistakes too late to correct them. At the church, I positioned myself where I could observe the family dynamics during the service. Michael's ex-wife and his son sat separately, their body language suggesting years of accumulated hurt and resentment. The boy, perhaps 17, seemed particularly withdrawn, his face a mask of anger and pain. During the graveside service, something extraordinary happened. As the minister spoke about forgiveness and redemption, Michael's son suddenly looked up and stared directly at me. His expression changed from anger to confusion, to something approaching understanding. After the service, he approached me with his mother trailing behind, clearly concerned about his sudden change in demeanor. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "During the drive from the church, did you hear anything unusual?" I looked at him carefully, then at his mother, weighing my response. "What did you hear?" I asked quietly. "My dad's voice," he said, tears starting to form in his eyes. He kept saying he was sorry, over and over. He said he'd made mistakes and wished he could take back all the hurtful things he'd said. He said he loved me and was proud of me. His mother looked stunned. "I heard it too," she whispered, "in the car behind the hearse. I thought I was imagining it, but Robert was apologizing for the divorce, for putting us through all that bitterness." They stood there for a moment, processing what they'd experienced. Then both looked at me with expressions of gratitude mixed with bewilderment. "Thank you," the boy said simply. "I don't understand how, but thank you." I nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in my throat. Since that experience, I've approached these whispered requests with greater reverence and purpose. I understand now that some passengers require more than transportation. They need someone who can carry their final words to the people they've hurt, someone who can bridge the gap between regret and reconciliation. The families never know exactly how these messages reach them, but they consistently report experiences that suggest their loved ones found ways to communicate apologies, forgiveness, and love during the journey to their final rest. I still hear the whispered requests, still linger after services to witness the healing that occurs when families receive the words they needed to hear. I've become a translator for the language of regret, a carrier of messages that transcend the boundary between life and death. And sometimes, when I'm driving empty routes or heading home after particularly emotional services, I find myself hoping that when my own time comes, someone will be there to carry my apologies to the people I've failed to forgive, or failed to ask for forgiveness from, while there was still time to speak the words myself.